Well, folks, Andrew Yang continues to be a candidate for president in the Democratic primary. And George and myself have discussed Andrew Yang on previous occasions. So we figured we would once again continue to discuss the continuing story of Andrew Yang and his presidential campaign. Take it away, George.
The dark horse rides. It's not many people expected it. I kind of did. That, he has something, and I believe it's possible for him to win. And I know the scenario because I like professional wrestling. I grew up watching professional wrestling. I know that doesn't sound very cultured.
I wasn't allowed. My parents wouldn't allow any professional wrestling.
And I remember explaining this under a minute. The Royal Rumble, vacant world title. The Nature Boy Ric Flair. And keep in mind, Royal Rumble, you have to be thrown over the top rope to be disqualified. He enters number 2 in the match out of 60.
You're speaking a foreign language, but go on.
They're like, oh, he can't win. He's entering too soon. He's a bad guy. Boo. But he hangs in there. And Hulk Hogan's in that. No, Flair can't beat Hulk Hogan in a fair fight. He never does. Hulk Hogan's indestructible. But he hangs in there, Flair. And towards the end, not making it complicated, Hogan is betrayed by his friend, who he later feuds with, who becomes a bad guy wrestler. And the bad guy wrestler helps pull him out of the ring after he's thrown out of the ring. And then Flair assists, throwing Hogan out of the ring. Last one standing. They screw Sanders. They screw themselves because no one wants anything to do with the Democratic Party after the disgusting display of what they do to Sanders. Yang is the man. It could happen. That's the scenario for him winning. Why he should win, I'm not saying that. There's some interesting features to Yang. We talked about UBI. And I think he's...
Why don't they call it Ubi?
Ubi?
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Okay, that maybe he'll see the video, he'll pick it up.
Just throwing it out there. Instead of calling it UBI, call it Ubi.
It might mean like a curse in an African language or some more obscure language
That
of a
would
tribe.
make it even more hilarious, right?
Yeah, a little more interesting.
Go on.
No, but Yang is he is a compelling figure. He's interesting, and I would actually connect this to American life. In some way, Yang is bringing, in a way, Asian Americans into the wider culture in a way that I haven't seen. Because I grew up, and he has a kind of outsider sense of humor that a lot of people aren't aware of. That when I was like, young Asian men have this kind of sense of humor about being an outsider, and he has that, and he's kind of honed it to perfection. And he has a kind of appeal of a person that if he gets time on stage, I notice people notice him. Democratic Party, they have a thing where you should notice this person. And it works somewhat, but then people start noticing Yang again. He has a kind of charisma character. I don't want to overstate it. But you can see that he's not a sprinter. He's a marathon runner, and he's running.
Well, thanks to you, I actually did read The War on Normal People. It's not actually a war against the National Organization for the Reforming of Marijuana Laws. It's actually a war against people that are like average, like normal.
I think they're doing quite well.
Yeah. I read the book. I skimmed it. I didn't read the whole thing, but important stuff in there. All the kind of economic data that I'm always talking about the failure of capitalism, and people being left behind and a whole generation without a place to go. And it's all in there. And how Trump is a symptom of capitalism and crime. I mean, it's all in there. It very, very valuable. He seems to, be the only candidate. What Sanders touches on a surface level, when he talks about student debt and stuff, he gets into it in great depth. A lot of really important statistics and data in here about the crisis that we're facing, and a recognition that it's rooted in technological advances. But the solution is give everyone free money. And that's where he seems to be missing. And this is Marxism. I mean, Marxism says that capitalism seeks to eliminate workers from the means of production. It's a classic problem of capitalism. And Marxism says it is resolved by the workers seizing control of the banks, factories, and industries and organizing them in a rational way. I was reading the memoir of the only U.S. Army general ever to be taken captive, William F. Dean, and he talked about how in the prison, the North Korean soldiers argued with him about this very issue, about automation. They said, what a crazy country you have in America, where unions work really, really hard to stop advances in technology because it'll eliminate jobs. In North Korea and in China and the Soviet Union, workers want advances in technology because it means there's less work for everyone to do, and it's a good thing. And that is a central component of the Marxist ideology. Marxists have been Andrew Yanging before Yang was born, except we say the obvious answer is state control of the means of production, not operating the means of production in order to make a profit for a group of owners, but rather operating them in a rational way, socialism, right? And now we know, thanks to China, and thanks to some of what's gone on in the Cold War, we know that you need to have a market sector in socialism. You need to have private hotels, private restaurants. Maybe they can be worker cooperatives. That's better. I think worker cooperatives are better because everyone there has an incentive for the company to do as well as possible because they all get a share in the profits. They're not just getting wages. But you need to have private companies. You need to have a market sector. But overall, you cannot have the means of production operating on the basis of profit, or you're going to have this same problem. And it's all rooted in the fact that the worker cannot buy back the product that he produces. If you do basic Marxist mathematics here, right? The wages do not equal the cost of the product. There's no way that can ever happen. The worker cannot buy back what he produces, so you have this problem. And the more capitalism develops, the more they revolutionize the means of production, the bigger the problem gets. And furthermore, if you look at the great capitalist crises of history, where did they come from? They came from great technological advances, right? Before the Great Depression in the 1930s, what they said was the slogan that was everywhere, on every newspaper, on the walls, they said, Henry Ford has overtaken Marx. Ford has overtaken Marx. And it was because the Roaring Twenties were happening. Henry Ford had figured out this assembly line production, the Taylor methods where you speed up, and they were producing all these great products, and new inventions were happening, radios and refrigerators, and all kinds of things were happening. And so therefore, Henry Ford, with his highly mechanized, efficient capitalism, had proved that Marx was wrong. And then the Great Depression happened. Right? Ford has not overtaken Karl Marx. Well, Bill Gates has not defeated Karl Marx. Jeff Bezos has not defeated Karl Marx. Eric Schmidt has not defeated Karl Marx. Mark Zuckerberg has not defeated Karl Marx. And the same problem that happens whenever you have a great technological leap in capitalism is happening once again. And essentially, we're in a situation where, we've had a great, tremendous, a big leap in terms of technology. It's a leap that is far beyond anything capitalism has ever done. And so now we're having a crisis, a prolonged crisis of overproduction. And all of a sudden, the means of production, don't need as many workers, and we are facing a pivotal crisis. And that's Marxism. I mean, I have a book here on this shelf, a beautiful book called The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Peary, right? This book, when was this book published? It was published a long time ago. Nelson Peary, a great American Marxist. This book was published in 2001. And how much he predicted has come true, right? And he talks about automation, he talks about computers, all the stuff that Andrew Yang talks about, Marxists were talking about in 2001, and Karl Marx was talking about it in the 1800s. This is the problem of capitalism, where technological advancement leads to greater abundance, and under capitalism, greater abundance creates poverty. Am I wrong in anything I've said here?
No, I think that's right. I think Yang has certain strengths, but I mean, there is a weakness. He has a sort of faith in entrepreneurship, which I don't fault him. Maybe in his own life, he has manifested significant things with entrepreneurship. I'm not entirely attacking the entrepreneurial spirit, but there is where you have a certain analysis of cause and effect. There's a kind of ex nihilo type of thing going on where, we're going to have more entrepreneurship and it's going to fix things, and it's just not quite as explanatory as it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And that's a weakness in Yang. Yang maybe in a way that he admits the fading of the American dream, but with one hand, and he affirms it with the other. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a little bit of a shell game. I don't think he's disingenuous, but this is the kind of cognitive dissonance a lot of Americans have. And some would be supportive of him for the wrong reasons, some for better reasons. But I definitely see what you're saying.
Well, the other thing, and he was in the Obama administration, right? He had a role. He was close to Barack Obama, and it's almost like he's been assigned to run his campaign as an educational campaign. It's interesting. Communists used to have, and still do have, educational campaigns. Nobody thought Gus Hall was going to win the election in 1976 or 1980 or 1984. He was running in order to get the Communist Party's message out there, right? And I part of me wonders if the Yang campaign is essentially the Obama administration. Some of the highest, smartest minds in the United States have become aware of all the problems that he talks about. And his campaign is about getting the message out there that we have this problem of automation hanging over our heads, that Trump is a symptom of it, and that bigger crises are ahead down the road. And there's the other thing, that Cass Sunstein, who worked in the White House, he wrote that book called Nudge, and this is a nudge for UBI or UBI or whatever as a solution to deal with it, right? And he's doing his job very, very well, and he's a maverick, and he's building his own personality. And I think he'll come out of this election, no doubt, with a following. We will hear more of Yang. He won't go away after this election. I think we will hear about him, and he'll have a following, and his message will resonate. And Trump won the election in 2016 by saying he was going to build a wall. Where did that come from? Who first said build a wall? Right?
That
Pat Buchanan.
Guy,
Pat Buchanan. I mean, he ran a presidential campaign in 1996 saying build a wall, right? That idea had been around in far right-wing circles. But Trump was the first candidate, first mainstream electable candidate to actually run all the way with it. And it seems like, like Yang is putting UBI out there. He's putting UBI out there. And that this points to that big divide among the American ruling class. Most American capitalists, I would call them entrepreneurial. They're concerned about making their own profits. They just want to maximize their own profits. They want their taxes to go down. They want to pay workers less. They want less regulation so they can maximize their profits. But among the highest levels, the richest of the rich, the managerial bourgeoisie, I call them. These are like the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers. That's ExxonMobil. That's Chase Bank. They're in there with the Morgans. They're not going to lose out. They're not going to go out of business, right? They're more thinking, how can we have social peace? How can we have social peace? And how can we maintain our monopoly? About the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, that the ultra rich faction, right?
It's kind of like the UFC, where there's a position, if you get on top of the guy, the way you pummel him is not really overzealous, but you always have leverage and you'll never do anything to lose it. Yeah, I don't know if that's my understanding. There's a way you kind of, if you can get on a man's chest, and that's kind of like the big companies are. They're not just like berserking. They're not just trying to destroy a man's face as quickly as they can. They're on top of us and they know it, and give it time and they'll beat us down.
And their viewpoint is much more long-term, and it's much more based on how do we have social peace so we maintain our monopoly, so nothing shakes up, they say don't turn over the turn-up truck or whatever. Nothing shakes things up enough that they would lose their monopolies. How do we have social peace in the long term? They're not thinking about their short-term profits. They're not thinking lower my taxes, deregulate, lower everyone's wages, I want my money. That's entrepreneurial aspect. They're thinking more in terms of how do we make sure in the long term we have social peace. And I think they probably think Andrew Yang is onto something. And that the problems that gave rise to Donald Trump need to be resolved, and maybe UBI is a solution. But the scariest thing is that this ultra-rich faction, they're the Malthusians, historically, right? I mean, John D. Rockefeller was the father of Malthusianism. He's the one who paid for the Birth Control League, and which eventually became Planned Parenthood. He hired a former communist to do it, Margaret Sanger. On top of that, I mean, these folks, they created the sexual revolution. Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey's research would never have been promoted. And that they very much have a view not of how do we just make profits in the short term, but how do we manage the rabble? How do we control them? And how do we keep the current structure in the world where we have oil as the basis of the global economy? And that oil is a virtual monopoly by Wall Street and London-based corporations. And how do we keep that world order intact and have stability and social peace in the long term for the longest time? And that's their viewpoint. And part of what is necessary to maintain that at this point, if you're going to maintain that order, and we've heard this from John Podesta and other people, they're going to have to reduce the human population, right? Because the human population as it is, under capitalism, at this point, they don't have a role for us in the means of production. And all these people outcast and starving, that becomes a mob. And the mob then has a demagogue to lead it. They start demanding social reforms. That's Trump. That's Sanders. That's, Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it's the beginnings of populism. They don't want that. They want social peace. Roosevelt had a relationship with the Rockefellers. It was kind of an alliance. He also had a relationship with the communists and stuff. But one thing he said dictatorship is created by hungry stomachs. And I think that's that managerial viewpoint. Okay, in order to have social peace, we need to not have hungry stomachs, because that can either lead to fascist Bonapartism or it can lead to socialist revolution. We don't want either of those things. We want stability, right?
Well, that's sort of where I was getting at when I was talking about wrestling, the possibility of Yang in our near future. In that story, Sanders is Hulk Hogan. His good guy who becomes a bad guy friend is the Democratic Party. Warren, I feel like if Yang is a workable formula, even if it's not the one they want, if you have, people hate the Democratic Party, Sanders can't get the nomination, Yang is what's left.
Mm.
And is there a way, we don't like Yang, but could this fit our model? And there's a dark side to the kind of picture of the UBI. He talks in that when they want people's information instead of work, I can kind of see a sci-fi future where we'll give you this money to live, but people know if decreasing population can offset the falling rate of profit, that the kind of life people will have, and we're beginning to see signs of it, where it's like YouTube instead of Friends, a job where I don't know what I do if I have one and it pays very little. This is a recipe for spiking suicide rates, people not having the optimism to have children, that you could kind of, you can make people end their lives with their own hands. I'm beginning to see this in my own life. The people around me, I'm getting a sense that, some could be in a condition like that they're this kind of high-tech cattle arrangement for man.
And the scary realization, and I don't know how the socialist movement is going to deal with this, but it's a weird realization. And the whole Russiagate thing and all of this and the rise of Ron Paul isolationism, and like you talked about at the airport, you met a guy who was Southern and conservative but was in love with the Chinese Communist Party, thought they were awesome. And that the thing is, this viewpoint that we get from the richest of the rich, this pessimistic viewpoint, right? It doesn't believe in the hope for the future. It's how do we keep the world order maintained, and how do we kind of reduce the population and do what's necessary to manage people like cattle to make it happen, right? That's their viewpoint. Whereas, those fracking companies that like Trump, Betsy DeVos with her Amway Tupperware parties and her brother Eric Prince of Blackwater, Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot, you go down the line, those folks believe in growth. They believe in economic growth. They want to make profits. And socialist countries like China, like various countries that have broken out of the capitalist system, they believe in growth also because they're poor, they're underdeveloped countries, and they're trying to raise their people out of poverty. And that even though the Betsy DeVos crowd are more free market and don't want the government involved at all, and they still, in their minds, believe in growth. And the socialist and anti-imperialist countries of the world also believe in growth. And they want more business and more commerce, and they want to, and so there's this weird moment where the anti-imperialist forces around the world have more in common economically and in terms of their worldview than the quote-unquote liberal forces do. That the right wing of the United States that still believes in growth and still is optimistic in this free market, crazed, libertarian way, and the countries around the world where the banks, factories, and industries are run by the state, and the state plans out the economy, they have a weird kind of, coinciding of interests, where they both believe in growth, and that the pessimism, right, the Greta Thunberg, endless economic growth is bad. We all need to, take ships instead of planes, and replace coal power with windmills and fusion energy. We can't even talk about it. And that viewpoint, that pessimism that flows from the richest to the rich, is the enemy of the socialist and anti-imperialist bloc, and it's the enemy of the lower levels of American capital. So there's this weird moment where like industrial capitalists in the United States and socialist and anti-imperialist forces have an alliance, and the force that really has the power in the world, the richest of the rich, is who they're both against. And that's what makes all of this so strange. During the Cold War, it wasn't like this. During the Cold War, there was a feeling that Rockefeller and all them were sensible. They were more friendly, less warlike, and it was the, John Birch Society military-industrial complex that were the main enemy. Now it's a totally different ball field. Look, you have to believe in growth at this point. If you don't believe in growth, you can't be optimistic. If you think that, hey, we just all have too much, we need to go back to wanting less, I mean, the rulers of this world would love you, right? And don't have children and reduce the population and just, gradually just, kind of check out and reduce everything. I mean, that's their viewpoint. And it's a viewpoint for managing humanity like cattle and keeping the current world order intact. But growth is good. There is no limit to growth. There's only a limit to profits. I want to popularize that slogan. It's a new slogan I want to populate. There is no limit to growth. There's only a limit to profits. Because the reality is there is no limit to growth. I mean, that's the truth. We could get to fusion energy. We could get resources from other planets. We could get to a higher fuel source. Human progress cannot end. Human beings innately want to expand. Human beings invent things. They change the environment. They force the environment to serve them. The nature of human beings, the entire reality of human existence is progress. Animals, yeah, ants have been building the same colonies for thousands of years. They haven't invented new ant colonies. They're just doing it the same way. Animals are stagnant, but the nature of humanity is as a creative creature that is constantly looking to advance. And when a faction exists that wants to rob that, to rob the human species of that, they're going to lose because they're going against, it would be like telling people not to procreate. It'd be like telling people not to eat. You can't, the nature of humanity is one way. There are very few things that I would call human nature, right? They always use that against Marxists. But one thing that is specific to the human existence is a desire to grow, build, and expand.
Well, I would not take issue with that. I would try to frame why people of goodwill are seeing it different. You mentioned Greta. I just want to mention there's a joke I have. I think she's 600 years old. Look at Northern Renaissance paintings. She's in every other painting. She's 600 years old.
That's funny.
I swear. I saw her and I knew I've seen her hundreds of years ago. I had evidence of her existence. But people, are a little bit, not Ted Kaczynski, but they're looking at their lives with technology and they're thinking, I didn't have so much technology. I had more friends and family. I used to talk on a phone once in a while as a convenience. Now I'm addicted to look at this thing. On and on. It's becoming more like the ravages of an addict. It's not a happy situation. I know it's making me shallow and I can't stop. I'm saying hurtful things online that I would never say in a conversation. And I don't seem that does not seem like it's making me more of a human being. It seems like a lot of people, they feel like the technology, what they're being told is progress, is robbing them of their humanity right now. And there's a certain disgust. Young people are more sensitive, are feeling that. The trajectory of where we're at right now with technology, it seems to have the wrong shape for people to be optimistic about it.
Well, it's weird because, in the old Roman Catholic tradition, right, one of the truths that's like, it's very buried, but there is, if you go back to like old Catholic theology, one of their justifications for, banning quote-unquote vices, like over-drinking, overeating, masturbating, premarital sex, one of their justifications for that is that they say to be doing that kind of behavior causes one to lose their freedom, right? One becomes addicted by engaging in that kind of behavior. And the reality is that it is much easier to control people by addicting them than it is by coercing them. If someone holds a gun to your head and says to you, okay, I got a gun to your head, do what I say, you'll do it, but you're going to resent them. You're like, you asshole, you put a gun to my head.
He who conquers by force only conquers by half.
But if you give somebody a pill and it makes them feel really good, and then you give it to them again and it makes them feel really, really good, and then you give it to them again and they feel really, really good, and then they come back to you and they say, I really need that pill again. And you say, well, you got to do something for me. They'll do it. To be someone's drug dealer is a far more effective way to control them. And they might even, in their minds, maintain that you're good the whole time because you gave them this pill that makes them feel really good. And I'm sure, they're just giving it to you. And that it's much easier to control people by addicting them, by rewarding them, by getting them in a position where they're dependent on you. That is a far more effective way to control people than outright coercion, than threat, than punishment. And I think that there's a realization of that, right? And that this methods of social control in our time are very much addictive mechanisms, right? Getting people addicted, getting people dependent, right? Whereas, if people are being coerced, right? If you're pointing a gun at someone saying, do this, there's 1 in 100 people, maybe 1 in 1,000 people who will try to knock that gun out of your hand and say, you will not control me, and will seek to become heroic. That's heroism, right? That's throughout all of human history. You have people that will just, in the face of coercion, will be bold and brave enough and do that, and then other people will rally behind them, right? This is like William Wallace, this is Joan of Arc, this is Spartacus, right? But that addiction control doesn't give people... it doesn't create heroes, right? You don't have a Mao. You don't have a Lenin. You don't have a Nat Turner, right? This kind of coercive control where you're addicting people, you're giving them stuff, and gradually controlling their behavior. It's a much more effective way of preventing human struggles from bursting out, preventing heroism, and honestly, that's probably my greatest fear with Yang, is I feel like UBI is essentially it's soft power control. Rather than having a straight up police state, get people hooked, give them phones to look at, and manage the cattle while you gradually reduce them and keep them from breeding and get them to the point they kill themselves, and we resolve our problem of overproduction.
It's brilliant soft power in that it's not radical, but it taps money is fungible. So the money. The UBI becomes something where people have a sense of their own autonomy, where it's like you can tell your own story. If you're a Christian housewife and you want to give your pastor an extra $20 and buy a big turkey, you can do that. If you're a homosexual and you want to go to Madrid, you can do that. And you can tell a million stories of what people can do with their money. And it's nothing really radical, but people will believe that they have more of an authorship of their life. It's seductive because it connects to the fears that people have, even if they're not. I don't think they're articulating them as well as you do, but they have some awareness of mass man in a technological society, and this does not radically change society a way a Marx or Kaczynski would. Nothing that stark either way, and then people get preoccupied with their story. If they're not getting by, maybe they're getting by and it takes them longer to save to do something they want to do, or maybe they're just getting by now and they don't have a family and they want to be more of a hedonist in some way. And there's all sorts of stories, but UBI, it kind of doesn't change the system, but it shifts things in a way where people feel like the system has been changed. Because their life, it's funny, you can really change a lot of people's lives without changing a system. You would think that couldn't be true, but it is. You could, at least for a time.
Indeed. So I'm curious what happens next with Andrew Yang. We have our predictions here. You're saying that it's possible he could pull ahead. I'm saying I think he'll come out of this election with a cult of personality and with a following, and that this is a nudge. But we'll just have to see. But it points to the bigger question. And this is what's the question that's hanging over our heads. We are in a long-term crisis of overproduction right now. Right? And I've noticed it always takes like 10 years for the country to catch up. 1968, you had a political crisis in the United States. It wasn't really till 78, 79, you had the United States really at the point where it was post that crisis, right? We got the post-1960s America in the last years of Jimmy Carter, right? And I feel like the moment we're at now, right? We're 10 years on from the financial crisis, 2020, right? 2008, 2009, we had the meltdown. It's over 10 years now. We are in post, housing bubble burst, post financial meltdown America. That's where we're at. This is the new America. And in the new America, you have a far right and you have a far left. The terms of political discourse have expanded. You have a Sanders and you have a Trump and Steve Bannon, right? And that we are going to start having conversations about socialism now. But it won't be, they don't want a straight up conversation about Marxist socialism, but we're going to start talking about adjusting capitalism, right? And the right is going to talk about adjusting it in kind of a nationalistic way, like they do in Europe, right? The longest time in the USA, the far right has never questioned capitalism. Well, now we're in a period where we have a right-wing, nationalistic, paleo-conservative critique of capitalism that's growing. And we're going to get a left-wing critique of capitalism. And Sanders is growing, and interest in Marxism is expanding. And so, I feel like we have now, 10 years on, entered post-2008, post-Occupy Wall Street, post-Tea Party, post-Obama America. This is the new America, folks, and you're living in it, right? Now, the question is, how much does America continue to advance? How deep do things get, right? Things were relatively stable following the 1970s, but how much is that? We are entering a period of capitalist crisis. The capitalists are fighting amongst themselves, right? The rate of profit is dropping. They are trying to stabilize their system, and we are going to see bigger and bigger issues. And the reality is there is an alternative now. And that's the scary thing that hangs over all their heads. There is an alternative. There is an alternative, right? The One Belt, One Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, Bolivarianism. I mean, there are economies that don't have these problems. They're stabilized by the state. You know what I mean? The state controls the means of production and allows growth, and there is an alternative, and that alternative continues to grow. So we are in this weird period. And we just have to see what happens next. Here's a question. Is the USA capable at this point of doing, what it did in Iraq? I don't know, honestly. The USA invaded Iraq 2003. The UN said, basically told them they couldn't do it. NATO wasn't for it. The other NATO countries, they went in alone unilaterally and invaded a country and toppled the government. Will that ever be able to happen again? I mean, Libya, they were able to pull it off. NATO was for it. The Russia and China didn't step in, but Syria, they haven't been able to pull it off. I mean, and Trump, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the leading Iranian general. But I mean, I wonder. I mean, are we at the point where the USA just isn't able to do? I mean, Reagan invaded Grenada, very famous, right? It was like a 2-hour war or something, Invaded Grenada, right? The U.S. invaded Panama. The Iraq thing used to be frequent. That used to be an everyday. That was, post-1970s America, late Cold War. The USA, we'd wake up and they'd say, we're invading wherever today because they're doing blah, 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 blah. And, years later, we'd find out that was all made up and it didn't really happen, Naria testimony, etc. But the USA doesn't seem to have that kind of unilateral ability now. Geopolitically, they don't have that ability. What I also think is interesting, though, is, under the Obama administration, and really under the Bush administration first, and then under the Obama administration, some things were changed. Some geopolitical international norms were changed, right? Under Bush, it became that the USA could detain people get accused of being terrorists and not charge them and just keep them at this special prison called Guantanamo Bay without any charges, never try them, just kind of keep them there indefinitely. And they're still there in Guantanamo. And then Obama took it to the next level, and he said, well, not only that, if we declare somebody to be a terrorist, even if they're a U.S. citizen, we can just execute them with flying killer robots, kill them. But the reason that they got away with this was because the people that they were using this against were Wahhabi extremists and terrorists, right? People with ties to Saudi Arabia, with that Wahhabi ideology and those terrorist networks the ISIS, Al-Qaeda types. Everyone hates those people. But things would have been very different if Bush had detained like the leaders of a foreign government, right? Things would have been very, very different if Obama had started killing prominent leaders of a foreign government with his flying killer robots. So now, what was developed as a means, probably a mechanism for controlling and like a threat hanging over Wahhabi terrorists while we incited them to fight Gaddafi or incited them to fight Assad, has now become a vehicle that could be used against a foreign state, right? We had John Bolton actually threaten to put Nicolas Maduro in Guantanamo. Did you hear about that?
Well, he's a very serious Islamist, isn't he?
And now we're at the point where Trump has actually used a drone to kill the top general in Iran. So now these mechanisms that were created to control and threaten Wahhabi terrorists are now being used as a mechanism against a state. And that opens all kinds of doors, but it also raises all kinds of questions now. Because at this point, right, the USA says somebody is no good, and it happens to be the top general of a foreign sovereign nation, they have the right to kill them, or they have the right to arrest them and take them to a prison indefinitely and torture them and do all kinds of things. I mean, this is a change, and Russia and China are not going to stand for that. If they tried to kill a top Chinese general with a drone, I think that there would be repercussions that would shake the planet. You know what I mean? If they tried to kill a top Russian general with a drone, there would be repercussions that would shake the planet, right? And we're entering this field where they have pushed things, and they're trying to do everything they can to not have an all-out war, but to see what things they can do short of that. Like when they grab people. Have you seen that? When they grabbed Meng, the daughter of the CEO of Huawei.
Yeah, a while back.
Yeah, they grabbed her. They've accused this Russian guy of he's in federal prison right now. This Russian guy, I interviewed him, Victor Bout. They've accused him of all kinds of stuff. Russian government says the charges don't add up, and he's a Russian. But it's an experiment. What can we get away with, right? Okay, maybe we can't drop bombs on Russia. Maybe we can't drop bombs on China, but we can grab a prominent person, or we can, this is a game they're playing. Is like, what can we do? What can we do now that we can't do what we always used to do, which is just send in the Marines and overthrow the government?
You're hitting on something, and I might actually connect this to UBI, that part of the appeal of UBI is we're socially isolated, we're thinking at best of ourselves as a union of egoists, basically, or just individuals, and we're playing this chess game, and it's like, I'm running out of moves. This is not going to hold up. And it's just the weirdest thing that the capitalist class, the state in large measure, they seem to have, at the game they play, less moves than we do. They're really maxing out the strategy they have. They don't seem to have any new stuff. It seems there's always like an element of retread in what they do. It seems like I would like to live past this decade. Hopefully many of us will.
Yeah.
And part of that is because it just seems like they're running out of moves, and I want to see what it looks like when they're all gone. And I don't think they have a decade's worth of moves left.
Indeed. Well, always a pleasure, George.